discovery of the correspondence between Jolly West and Sidney Gottlieb, who obviously was, the at the head of MK Ultra, and
Right, right.
his letters writing to him under this pseudonym. And the importance of that obviously is that it establishes a undeniable connection between the Manson murders and MK Ultra, at least in my
Yeah,
opinion.
yeah. That was I mean, for some reason you just describing it now made me remember the day I discovered those letters.
How did you feel when you discovered those letters addressed to
Well,
Sherman
I'd
Gould?
already, it was, I think, the summer of 2000. I'd already been working for at least a year.
Hmm.
Well, no, a year and a half. And when I started looking for evidence of MK Ultra, and it's kind of hard to go into without getting too deep in the weeds, but there was a psychiatrist named Jolly West who was doing research at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic in '67. And that was when Manson and the girls were going there on a daily basis in the summer of '67. And that's the summer that Manson kind of all of a sudden transformed into this magical person who could get people to do his bidding.
Right.
And I knew that West had had these accusations that he'd been involved in this horrible brainwashing program that the CIA ran for almost 25 years
Hmm.
in secret that had been exposed in the mid to late '70s. And when it was exposed, the very first story about it on the banner headlines of the New York Times, West was one of, I think, a dozen researchers at universities who was accused of doing, drug and hypnotism experiments on patients and prisoners and human subjects without their knowledge or consent.
And this
And
is
he
from the
immediately
church
didn't.
committee in 77. Is that
No,
what you're
no,
referring to?
well, it led to the church committee.
Okay.
It actually, the story was broke in '76 because of John Marks, who I think it was off camera, you talked about his book, Search for the Manchurian
Right.
Candidate.
Right.
He found the financial records of the program. Program had been dismantled in '72, '73, right when Richard Helms, who was the head of the CIA then, was about to resign or get fired by Richard Nixon because Watergate was blowing up and they weren't agreeing on how Helms was going to cooperate with the investigators, and he was under investigation for some other stuff. So
Hmm.
he and Sidney Gottlieb, who you mentioned earlier, they destroyed all the records because they knew that had they ever the records of the actual experiments, had they ever come out, both those men could have gone to prison for the rest of their life.
Of course.
So they destroyed everything, but they accidentally left boxes of financial records in a warehouse that a State Department kind of employee, but very low level, found John Marks, and he took them to I think a congressman or a senator, and Seymour Hirsch, who was a big investigative reporter at the
Hmm.
time at the New York Times, found out about it. So he wrote the first story. And because of those initial stories, they had three different congressional investigations, Otis Pike, Frank Church, and then Ted Kennedy, Daniel Inouye hearings just into, well, Frank Church was a lot of government, CIA and FBI malfeasance that they were looking into and assassinations. The others were more interested in just the MK Ultra program.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so the bottom line is West never, his denial was all it took. He was never investigated. At that time, he was a very prominent psychiatrist at UCLA running the Neuropsychiatric Institute, head of their psychiatry. And I mean, it just astonished me that why would they take his word and not at least do some kind of investigation? And he went, he died 20 years later, right before I started this, I think in '98, and I started in '99. And up until the time of his death, every now and then these accusations would be repeated,
Right.
and he would get furious and threaten to sue the papers, reporters, whomever. And I just had a gut feeling that there was evidence that he had been involved in this. And I followed my gut. And it took me about 2 months of going through his papers that had been left at UCLA. Nobody had seen them before me because he had only died the year before and nobody had requested them, so they hadn't been processed. So I found them. They were missplit, he never would have left them in there. They were an indictment of him. They showed that he had lied for 30 years. And yeah, so that day I remember having once I really vetted it and figured out that they had to be authentic and what it meant, because especially West's involvement with Jack Ruby and
Mhm.
his aftercare after the assassination. Um, I remember calling my agent and thinking he's going to finally say, "You've lost your mind, stop. This can't be." And again, even then, I told Sloan, my agent, I go, I know I'm a year late already, and but I think I'm going to need at least another year. Still not knowing that there were like 17 more years left or 18 more years
Yeah.
left.
Little did you know.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
fantastic. So I know that you mentioned in another interview that one of the people that tipped you off kind of to start investigating Jolly West and the whole MK Ultra angle was Ted Gunderson. Can you tell me a little bit more about that and maybe some of the
I'm
things he
amazed
told
that
you?
people know him because
Oh yes, we know Ted Gunderson in this world.
oh, yeah, I have very mixed feelings about him.
Yeah.
So I went, all I knew then, and again, this is before he probably wasn't even on the internet yet. He had left the FBI.
Hmm.
He had written a book about the child kidnapping,
Right.
sex ring things.
Right.
And I just wanted to talk to him because he'd been an LA FBI agent in 69, and none of those guys would talk to me. And I was told he was a loose cannon. He was a little nuts, but go see him, buy his book, and I'll talk to you. So he was giving a reading somewhere like in Podunk, California. And after the reading, I approached him. He agreed to have dinner with me. And during the dinner, at that point, I didn't know Jolly. I mean, Jolly West hadn't come into my sphere. I was just
Right.
trying to figure out what happened to Manson in 67 that gave him the ability to get people to go out and kill
Hmm.
strangers. That he could order that within a few months of getting out of prison. All of a sudden, he has this amazing power. And Ted started telling me about MKUltra, which I hadn't heard of. And then he said, and there's a psychiatrist named Jolly West who was in the Haight doing MKUltra research when Manson was there. At that point, a little light bulb went off in my head because I had actually interviewed West like 5 years before for another story I was doing about celebrity stalkers. And at that point, he was an expert on all kinds of like psychopathic, sociopathic, violent behavior. And one of his specialties was people who became obsessed with celebrities, so
Hmm.
much so that they wanted to kill them. And I had met him at UCLA to interview him, and he was just a bore and pedantic. We couldn't have a dialogue. It was like he was lecturing me. He was rude. I never even transcribed the tape. And I had no idea that I thought I'd never think about him again when I left him after an hour one day at UCLA. I never thought this guy would come back into my life 5 years later when he's dead, and I'd spend almost 20 years researching him.
Yeah.
So I knew who he was, and I think I might have just had one or two more conversations with Ted. I thank him in the book and the acknowledgments, and it really wasn't until Dan, my collaborator, in 2017 and 18, when we were putting the book together, he said, we have to have something in here explaining how West all of a sudden was on your radar.
Hmm.
And I could not remember. So it took me a few days and I went through all my interviews and I couldn't find who the first person was to bring him up because it was about 15 years
You
earlier.
just
And
couldn't
then
remember.
I found it because luckily I'm pretty good at having dates and times, and I can do word searches in my main transcript, which is massive.
Hmm.
So I figured out Ted Gunderson was the one that put me down that path.
That's wild. That's really wild. Yeah. Ted is an interesting guy. Some of his research, you have to kind of take with a grain of salt. I'm not exactly sure what to make of him, but I thought that was really interesting when I heard that he was kind of, who tipped you off to look at things, from that angle.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So I have to either thank him for it or hate him for it. I know he
yeah,
died a number of years ago, right?
I believe so. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that, you mentioned a few times 1967, and this being a significant year in Manson's story.
Yeah.
Prior to that, he had been in and out of jail, spent a massive portion of his life behind
Half
bars.
of his life, he was 32 actually when he was arrested for the murders, but he had spent 17 of those years in
Mhm.
federal institutions. So from the
Mhm.
time he was about 12, he was in juvenile homes. and youth incarceration institutions, but all federally run, nothing
Hmm.
state or county. They were all government run.
Hmm. And this is also at the same time that MKUltra was being spearheaded, and they were
Right.
doing research across, I think a couple hundred institutions across America,
100 that
colleges.
they finally admitted to, but it could have
Okay.
been many, many more. I mean, that's the biggest thing. I mean, and I have to look at the book. I don't know how much, we have so much history we're covering, and there was so much stuff I couldn't
Hmm.
put in there. I'm sure I cheated by having a lot of extra information in the end notes at the back of the
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
So, I mean, people like audiobooks. I like audiobooks, but I try to get people to get the paperback cover because the end notes aren't in the audiobook. And I mean, once all this came out, Ted Kennedy and Inouye, their committee, demanded that the Justice Department have an investigation and find victims of MK Ultra because
Right.
they knew there had to be. They said hundreds of people who've been experimented on, but it wasn't. It was thousands, and nobody wanted to do it at the Justice Department. So it was going bopping around to all these different investigatory law enforcement agencies, and finally the CIA said, "We'll just do it." They investigated themselves, and guess how many victims they found? Two.
Wow.
Both of them had died already. So they paid a little small settlement to two people that they admitted they had given some LSD to without their knowledge.
Hmm.
They didn't even go. What West was doing the experiments at Lackland Air Force Base on airmen. Never went there. Looked into West what he had done there.
Hmm.
He was doing it at University of Oklahoma, where he began their neuroscience department in 1954 or 5. Never went there, looked at what he might have done there, and then at UCLA.
I think that a lot of and this is kind of, just me brainstorming and my personal beliefs about it, but MK Ultra and stuff that came out in the church committee and stuff. I think a lot of it is kind of limited hangout. Maybe you might
Yeah,
call it.
yeah, yeah. I've read the church hearing
Yeah.
transcripts. I've read the Kennedy Inouye hearings, which are a little more. I mean, church had a lot of stuff to cover. It wasn't
Yeah. It
just
wasn't
MK
just MK
Ultra,
Ultra.
and he did it before Kennedy Inouye. Kennedy Inouye had about, I think, 2 days of hearings in September of '77, I think, and then two more days a few months later.
Hmm.
But everybody that they got to testify at the CIA was amnesic. They didn't remember
Hmm.
anything. They lied. And I can prove Gottlieb testified behind closed doors. They sealed his testimony for years. He lied. Everybody lied. They said they weren't successful at anything. The headlines in the papers were the gang that couldn't shoot straight.
Right.
The CIA took the fall because they didn't want people to know what they had learned actually how to do. They'd rather look like they were fools and
Buffoons.
buffoons. So, because they had created this technology, the only reason I know what I know is because West's letters, and especially that one in 55, when this is still 12 years, wait, 55, 17 years 17 years before they closed it, he already told them he could remove people's true memories, replace them with false memories. So imagine what they did in those next 17
Right.
years that we'll never know about. And it's only because he accidentally left these documents in his college file, 200 and some boxes of papers.
And the official narrative was that, they wanted to basically be able to program people to commit acts that they wouldn't normally, specifically, assassinations and things of that nature, and
Yeah,
then have
their
them
ultimate
memory
goal was
everything.
to create a programmed assassin. They also wanted to create couriers, like people who could go across
Mhm.
enemy lines with information, and if they're captured, they could somehow trigger them to forget what their information is, or if it's top secret, when they return, then erase that information from their memories, that kind of thing.
I'm always very skeptical of any admissions or informations coming directly from these types of agencies. So my
Yeah,
opinion has always been that that is maybe true, but probably just a very tiny portion of what they really were doing. My
yeah,
belief is
yeah.
that during this time, there was so much societal upheaval and, so many different things, civil rights movements and just growing distrust in the government, anti-war movements and stuff. And I think that MK Ultra as well as, COINTELPRO and these other programs were essentially just to neutralize, radical dissident youth movements. And I
Yeah.
think that MK Ultra, I think that, like the programmed assassins stuff and the Manchurian Candidate stuff that they made movies, they're willing to tell us that part of it. I really think that the more important things were hidden from us, and that it was always meant to be,
Like remote viewing and
domesticated.
all that kind of
Well,
thing.
even some things like that, I think that was probably more of a cover to the more
Yeah.
weird aspects like that, paranormal kind of things. I don't really know what to make of that. I just know that they had a hell of a lot to distract people from and to try to, dissuade people from wanting to, foment insurrection against the
Yeah.
government at that time. So I feel like that went hand in hand with a lot of other things during those times, in the 60s and 70s, and the proliferation of LSD and other drugs and stuff.
Yeah.
Um, I just think that's very interesting, especially because in some of those letters between West and Gottlieb, you mentioned that in one of them, and I'd be curious to know what year this letter was from, West said that it's getting near the time when they need to take it to the
Oh, take
field.
experiments out into the field.
What did he
I
mean
think,
by that? What would that look like?
well, at that time, he was doing his experiments on airmen at the base. And he said,
Is
right
this
now I'm
Lackland?
experimenting, pardon me,
Is this Lackland you're talking about?
Lackland Air Force Base
Uh-huh.
outside of San Antonio.
Okay.
So he was doing it on psychiatric patients at the base hospital, but he was also doing it on prisoners and just regular servicemen. But he felt confined. And he said, at some point, to understand how effective this really is, we have to take them out into the field, meaning away from the base, and get people to do shit in public.
Hmm.
And that's when, and it's a pretty chilling and kind of horrifying episode in the book. It was right after that letter that one
Hmm.
of the airmen who had gone to the hospital for treatment of very severe headaches, migraine headaches, um, was found near the body of a 3-year-old girl that he'd raped and murdered, and he claimed to have no memory of how he ended up there.
Right.
And he had clearly been the one who raped and killed her and probably abducted her.
And this is
And I
Jimmy
make the
Shaver, right?
case that he was one of West's early experimental subjects, but I had to also be careful because I didn't prove it, to my satisfaction. But I present in the book a circumstantial case that, again, I think it's more likely that he did do this than not. And I don't think he wanted this guy, Jimmy Shaver, no record of any, never been arrested for a crime, no violence.
Yeah.
And one night, he's found wandering around a gravel pit while there's a search party for this missing girl. And the people that find him, these two truckers at like 3 a.m, say, what are you doing here? And he said, I don't know how I got here. I don't know what's going on. And he has his shirts off and he's bleeding. And some of the blood is a little girl's who they found 30 yards away. And some of the blood was scratch marks that she had made on his body when he was killing her and raping her. I mean, interestingly, because of this book, the little girl, the last time she was seen was about midnight, the 3rd of July, 1953, I think it was, or 54. And there was a heat wave. People didn't have air conditioning then, or at least her family didn't,
Hmm.
and nobody could sleep. So the parents went to a saloon and they let the two kids play out in the parking lot. And that's when she vanished. And then they found her body about 3, 4 hours later. But the brother, who was a couple years older, his son, excuse me, son or grandson, now I can't remember. They had a podcast, and they contacted me. So it was the little girl who was killed at 3. It was her nephew, her grown-up nephew,
Hmm.
who had a podcast. And I thought, wow, this could be difficult for us to talk about. And he said, we've never been satisfied with the story we were told
Wow.
about what happened to her. So I did it. That was about a year or two ago, and they're still in Texas, I think. But yeah, it's just like the Tate LaBianca murders. I'm not saying that that's what they ultimately wanted, to kill a 8.5-month pregnant woman or kill this little 3-year-old, but they were fucking around with people's brains
Hmm.
without their knowledge, and then seeing what they could manipulate them into doing.
Hmm. And he fit the he was amnesiac of what had
Yeah,
happened. He
yeah,
did something that we safe to say he probably wouldn't have done in a normal state of mind, you know. So it fit that profile of MK Ultra so
Yeah.
perfectly.